The working class is afflicted with some of the most pressing challenges characterized by high inflation, joblessness, and gripping poverty. It is a time when the working class needs to be united more so than any other time. However, worker representation and the broad left is fractured, and what impact does this have in advancing the class struggle? That's up for discussion in today's edition of Workers' World Labour Show that starts now.
From England to Poland, every step across the ocean, the ruling classes them is in a mess. Oh yes, the capitalist system a regress, but the Soviet system now progress. So which one of them you think is best?
Welcome to the weekly Workers' World Labour Show. I'm your host, Teshadik Chubadi. Thank you so very much for being here. We have a very interesting conversation in light of a scenario where, well, the working class needs to be united more so than ever. Numsa and some of its challenges that it's been having over the last couple of weeks and months. The political and the organizational battle within Numsa that has come out in the public domain. The Numsa National Congress in Cape Town that was interdicted from proceeding 3 days before it was scheduled to start. However, the union's leadership effectively defied the interdict and went ahead with the Congress, including its national leadership elections. The disgruntled and excluded groups of Numsa's members and leaders have now gone back to court to seek a contempt order against Numsa's national leadership and the remedial measures. This conflict threatens to split severely and weaken South Africa's biggest industrial union. And in today's show, we unpack the crisis in Numsa and consequently the Trade Union Federation, SAFTU, the background to the crisis and analysis from our panel of guests, which I'd like to welcome at this time. Roger Etkin, the editor at Amandla magazine and former Numsa official. We also have Princess Majola, the secretary at the United Front. Dr. Dale McKinley is with us as well, a researcher and education officer at ILRIG. A very good day, and thank you very much for having joined us. Let's get into the conversation, perhaps with you, Dr. Dale. Paint us an overview about why this is a battle we don't quite need.
Well, I think first of all, thanks, Tashreeq, but I think first of all, the state of the union movement in South Africa generally has been declining for a number of different reasons for over a longer period of time. So already the union movement was facing challenges, as everybody knows, the split that SAFTU made from COSATU, the personal battles within COSATU between the GS of Numsa, Erwin Jim, and the SAFTU president, Zwelinzima Vavi. The role of union investment companies, we go back to SAMU, SAPAWU, many other organizations and unions which have been afflicted by this problem of money and capital and also of the capturing of particular interest within unions. So overall, we have a situation within unions which is very, very, how should we say, not a pretty picture. You combine that then with the macro picture in our country of a political economy in which many layoffs over the last decade and retrenchments, the increased turbocharging casualization of labor within South Africa as well, which has basically taken away a lot of the permanent workforce that used to basically be membership of the unions as well. So we've got a whole range of different problems, including wages, working conditions, you name it, an assault on from the ruling party on unions, an anti-union, basically politics from the ANC and from capital itself. And you combine all those kinds of things. And therefore, when you get a situation here where you have the largest union in the country in trouble for a range of reasons, it only pours fuel onto that fire.
It absolutely does. And Roger, from your perspective, let's look at Numsa in its totality. It is one of the strongest unions that one can find. It plays in the metal worker space, but it has gone into different sectors as well. There was, of course, the fracas with COSATU that led to it being instrumental in the formation of an alternate federation, and that being SAFTU. Just give us a very brief background about what Numsa is and the command that it holds in the working organized labor space.
Thanks very much and good evening, everybody. Numsa is the largest union not only in South Africa, but on the continent. It still has over 300,000 members. If we go back to the 2013-2014 period, Numsa took a very, very significant step in effectively breaking with the alliance with the ANC. In practical terms, what it did was to pass a resolution at a special national congress which said we are motivating that COSATU should no longer be in an alliance with the ANC. And what you call the fracas with COSATU was actually COSATU expelling Numsa. Numsa didn't leave voluntarily, it was expelled. Expelled for a couple of reasons, mainly in relation to the question of the ANC, but secondarily also in relation to an expansion of its scope. And that's what you referred to in your introduction. Originally, Numsa came from Metal and Allied Workers Union, was one of the first unions formed in the 1970s. And it came together to form Numsa together with those organizing in the auto sector, those organizing in the motor sector, garages and so on, and in the tire and rubber sector. So there were different unions came together. It was only in 2013 that it said, it's time to rethink this question of one union, one industry, and to look at how we organize perhaps instead what they called along the value chain. The value chain of metals starts with mining, and it goes all the way through to transport. And so that's what Numsa has done. Largely, I would say, a defensive move in that its industries, as other manufacturing industries, have persistently shrunk since, as a result of government policy over the last 27, 28 years. So it's expanded in order to be able to keep to roughly the same size as it was before.
Though that's an interesting case, because what we are hearing, the murmurs coming out of Numsa is that Irvin Jim wants to go political. He believes that political power needs to be contested. And before I get to what are some of the different themes of the division, let's get you on this issue at the moment, Princess Majola, the fact that there is a battle for the heart and the soul of Numsa. What does this appear to suggest? Is it ideological? Is it about methodology? Or is it really about, as Dr. Del McKinley paints, it gets complicated when there's investment money involved and processes are not being followed, etc. What is your reading of the divisions in Numsa at the moment?
Thank you. In my own view, I would say the infighting or conflict that is within the union. I hope I'm audible. That is within the union Numsa. According to my own views, it's because of, like you're saying, the investment companies. One would wonder if I understand correctly, an investment company is more of a company that was formed to create profits for the owners of that company, which, according to my view, would be your capitalists. But Numsa, being a union, it's an organization for workers, which is supposed to be taking care of workers, which is not supposed to be putting profits before workers. And that's an organization that's supposed to be led by workers. And the leaders who are leading it are supposed to be having that bond with the workers, not having that social distance of leaders also now becoming the bourgeoisie, the capitalists. So a company should be differentiated from an organization, especially an organization that's supposed to be liberating the working class.
Well, that's the conversation, because some of the assertions coming out of the union at the moment is that some of that investment money is being paid for birthday parties, which has very little to do with actually advancing worker issues. We'll get into that and more as we debate Numsa's very fractured relationship at the moment.
Before we continue, let's get into this week's highlights. Court orders worker be reinstated after being dismissed for challenging the work policies on high-heel shoes. MTN issues retrenchment letters as it restructures. Numsa is mobilizing for a total shutdown of Samanco. UPS drivers demand safety, not surveillance, in workplaces and trucks in New York City. And SAFTU and COSATU is mobilizing for a national shutdown on the 24th of August. All this and more later in your full bulletin. Over to Tashrik to continue this week's topic of discussion on the Numsa and SAFTU crisis.
Well, what we know is that Numsa has a very long history of its militancy. It was quite strong, and you know, we had Roger there outlining how it was kicked out of the federation because it argued that the ANC and the alliance was no longer a vehicle with which to attain the type of very real worker gains that would be required. But Dr. Dale, how complicated is that? I mean, there's been always an ideological debate about whether workers should be contesting political power in the form that it appears Numsa now wants to do. And I'm trying to understand whether this is a Numsa aspiration or an Irvin Jim aspiration.
It's a good question, Tashrik. In my opinion, it's not something that has been fundamentally resolved amongst the rank and file of Numsa, or for that matter, in many of the unions. I mean, if one looks at the impetus, for example, of the establishment of the Socialist Revolutionary Workers' Party, this came sort of from the side in many ways and came directly from the General Secretary Irwin Jim. What had been resolved at the Numsa conference and what had been resolved at SAFTU was the formation of a united front of a range of different left and progressive forces and unions and communities, particularly, which had been suffered from a great deal of unfortunate sort of decline, that relationship. And also the establishment of looking into what kind of political force would be necessary to carry the interests of the working class forward. Nobody talked about a vanguardist revolutionary force that should be established by a particular union and then pushed into elections immediately without any groundwork being done, without any kind of real mobilization being done. And so it was no wonder that when this happened, the Socialist Revolutionary Workers' Party completely and utterly failed to make any kind of impact on the electoral scene, and in fact was an embarrassment to any progressive and serious and mature left person in this country. So it's what you have is what you have in that sense is individuals and particular groups of people pushing a particular agenda, whether it was in Numsa or other particular unions, that they themselves believed in, but had never been really organically born from the rank and file itself and discussed properly. And as a result, what you have is you have a situation where Numsa and its general secretary, or I don't say Numsa rank and file as a union, but its general secretary, are running way ahead of the working class, completely ahead of their own rank and file in saying that this is exactly what we need. And as a result of that, it's not just, as Princess correctly points out, the social and material distance of the leadership. It's the ideological and political and organizational distance from the rank and file that is a result of this.
But what, Princess, to bring you in on that point, what does that look like? Because look, I mean, there is an ideologue in its making, that is Irvin Jim. But the reality is that we've seen, for instance, even in Britain, where you had the Labour Party trying to contest political power, which it had successfully done, and it served in opposition at some stage. Jeremy Corbyn was the Prime Minister. It showed that there is some form of proximity where Labour can contest political power. But as Dr. Del McKinley rightfully problematizes, is how much of that how much of that is actually the groundwork has happened. And I'm wondering whether if Numsa were to proceed in this direction and Irvin Jim is successful, do you think it has a chance to galvanize an electorate to give it a seat at the table?
Tariq, like Dr. Dale has said, SRWP, instead of it having that bottom-up approach, it ended up having the top-down approach, with the General Secretary of the Workers wanting also to be the chairperson and the face of the political party or the vanguard party. Then you wonder that the General Secretary was well known amongst the factory floors, amongst the workers. But there on the ground, in the communities, he was not well known. One thing that leaders make mistakes on, the General Secretary was living somewhere in the suburbs, but not aligning himself with those people on the ground. Maybe if the General Secretary or Numsa wanted to have that, or trade unions wanted to have a political party that will be inclined or aligned with just workers who would be mobilized on the ground, on the factory floor, then this would have worked. They would have got that seat back then in 2018. But because that was just a dream, that would have never been realized without groundwork being done there. And the very same masses knowing the leaders. So it had to be that done in a way that it was bottom up, not top down. But because of, thanks, Eric.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we have to wake up from that dream at some stage and realize that there's a nightmare that we are sitting with right now, Roger. And that nightmare is one where workers, first of all, don't appear to have much sort of political influence, with government at least. But, it's operating in a circle that is increasingly fading. The generations of workers are getting younger. And we see, a lot of these being public sector unions and not so much in the private sector. And so there is a sustainability question about whether Numsa would be able to maintain its momentum as one of the biggest, strongest unions and really contest perhaps not political power, but have at least influence in what makes up government policy.
Well, there's a couple of things to say about that, I think. The first thing is that the real crisis in this country is the social, political, and economic crisis that we're all living in. We've seen over the last few days, Kagiso, we've seen Tembisa, and those are just symptoms of a crisis in which service delivery has ground to a halt, in which our infrastructure is falling apart. And what this situation is crying out for is a broad working class response. And that working class response does need to take a political form, because it needs to represent the interests of the working class in the democratic institutions of the country. So that needs to be said. In terms of Numsa and what it can do, Numsa chose to set up a very, very narrow political party. Not only top down, exactly as Comrade Princess has said, but also narrow politically. A Leninist organization based on a type of organization that was required in an autocratic, completely undemocratic environment more than 100 years ago. Instead of looking at what is required, which is a broad working class organization and political organization. And the debate between Comrade Vavi and Ivan Jim is not a personal battle, and I would take issue with Dale on that issue. It's been overstated because it's simpler, isn't it? It's so much easier to say these are, two bulls in a kraal, so they can't survive with one another. They have a key political difference. Jim thinks that the way forward for the working class is a narrow Leninist vanguard party. It's a particular form of politics. I would call it Stalinist politics. Vavi favors a broader working class organization to represent the broad interests of the working class. Personally, I think that's a much more likely outcome to have some success. So there's a political debate there. In terms of the future for Numsa as a trade union, all trade unions need to grow beyond their industrial base and start organizing the precarious workers and start organizing those who don't have full-time jobs, who are more difficult to organize, but who need to be organized. Otherwise, they're all swimming around in the same 25% of industrial workers, and that pool is getting smaller. It's not getting bigger.
Yeah, it most certainly is, because if one looks at some of the facts, COSATU and NACTU were significantly stronger organizationally and politically during the 1980s. And that was, under a repressive state of apartheid, we have greater space within which to organize. There's certainly lots of incentive to do so, given high inflation rate, joblessness that exists, given the fact that the public sector wage really hasn't increased. We sit with austerity measures, lots of public companies that have been privatized. But where are the unions, and why don't they appear to have much of an influence? We'll get into that and more after the break. All right, we're talking about the challenges within the Labour Federation, that is SAFTU, and particularly Numsa. They went to a conference just the other day, which had been interdicted by the court. The court said you can't quite go ahead because you suspended members. That isn't particularly in line with your constitution. They proceeded to go ahead. Lots of money had been spent, and well, we sit with a scenario where elections had taken place, and that very election is now being challenged in court. But beyond that sideshow, there are bigger issues at play, and that's our conversation that we're having right now. Dr. Del McKinley, is there a way to navigate out of this challenge that we have right now? I mean, it kind of strikes me that, Irvin Jim said, bugger the court, let's just go ahead. We have the support, we'll figure it out afterwards. We've paid millions of rands to the convention center, lots of money has been spent on hotels. Let's just go ahead. What is your take about the conundrum that Numsa finds itself in now?
Well, I think it's important for us to not treat Numsa as some kind of monolithic entity. It is clearly a divided union. There are clearly many different perspectives. So when we say Irwin Jim, we mean Irwin Jim and those that might support him. And there's obviously a significant number of Numsa members who are not only taking the General Secretary to court and the office bearers, but there are many rank and file members that I would imagine are very, very disgruntled with what has happened. But given that situation, I think the larger politics here is incredibly concerning. We have a situation over the last decade in our country where politicians and certain people that would consider themselves activists, ANC, others, have basically said, we don't need the law. We can just decide as we go. We can do whatever we want. Power is the biggest determinant. And if we mobilize and we basically intimidate and we create fear and we use violence, intimidation, then we can get our way. To me, what has been happening in Numsa and what the office bearers have done, what happened in Samu, what happened with private security, bodyguards, threats, particularly to women, by the way, and women leaders, misogynistic, patriarchal politics rearing its head. This is the kind of politics that has infused our entire society. And basically, it's an incredibly dangerous politics because irrespective of whether we're left or whether we're anti-capitalist, if you basically have the law of the jungle and you say anything goes, well, we know what that ends up with. Basically, that ends up with powerful men controlling the show, and usually fascist men, and those who don't believe in any democratic control and certainly no worker control. So I think the larger politics here, without getting too deep into the Numsa legal issues, is that the politics that this represents is indicative of the problems that we're facing as a country and that we're fighting. I think that many poor and working class people are fighting, which is lack of accountability, giving a middle finger to democracy, basically saying the workers and the poor don't count, and that indeed, and I would argue that here is where the combination of the personal and the political come into play. It does matter what kind of individual leaders we have and what kind of individual politics they have, because they wield a lot of power. Yeah. And we cannot separate the personal from the political in that case. because the leaders not only have politically, they have a lot to answer for, but personally, their conduct also they have a lot to answer for.
And we've seen Irvin Jim go rather quiet over the last couple of years, I'd argue. You know, we saw him very loud and vociferous when the divisions in COSATU played itself out, but also matters in relation to government. And if there was a time for his voice to be found, even from an ideological perspective, I suppose, Roger, it would be now. I mean, they were a big player in what is happening at SAA, and there under their noses, the company got sold for a quick buck, and they were caught unaware. And I'm wondering whether the divisions within Numsa threatens this very broad issue that Dr. Dale McKinley does speak of, Roger.
I agree with Dale that there's a fundamental issue of accountability and democracy in Numsa. That, allied with a narrow rhetorical politics, has meant, as far as I can see, that Numsa is not in the news any longer because it has become irrelevant. It hasn't had anything new to say. Its general secretary has been preaching the nationalization of the commanding heights of the economy for 15 years, probably. If you listen to what he has to say, it's always the same. But when you're faced with a real, tangible issue, I'm thinking, for example, of ArcelorMittal. ArcelorMittal, you remember a couple of years ago, with the problem of Chinese dumping, was struggling. And it was asking for protection through tariffs. But ArcelorMittal, as a result of that company was worth virtually nothing. It was a prime candidate to be able to go to the PIC or some government agency and say, buy it for a song. Let's actually nationalize this through the PIC. But what did Ivan Jim, the revolutionary, do? He went hand in hand with ArcelorMittal's management to government and said, please give them protection, please give them tariffs. So in my opinion, and I've been of this opinion for quite a long time, in trade union terms, the kind of politics that the Numsa General Secretary represents is actually quite a conservative politics. And it's married with a fiery revolutionary rhetoric, which largely, to quote Shakespeare, is sound and fury, signifying nothing. It really doesn't. If you look at the politics, you've quoted SAA, high-felt steel went down. Was there even a murmur about perhaps some kind of factory occupation? Has there ever been that kind of murmur in Numsa? No, the answer is no. So Numsa's politics on the ground, in trade union terms, are conservative. Its rhetoric is revolutionary, and I think that's a very sterile combination. And that's what needs to be broken. And I think the way forward in trade unions now is the building, and it will be a long, slow process, but the building of a rank and file, a trade union rank and file from the factories upwards that will begin to really represent workers' interests in the workplaces.
Sounds to me like Irvin Jim may well be the Julius Malema of unions, but we'll come back to that at another time. Let's, Princess, try and look at the fact that he does, though, and when I refer to him, talking about that particular faction within the union does command big support, be it from a more middle class to an even sort of elderly age grouping within Numsa. What do we make of the fact that he does command support within the union, and what that would mean for the issues around transparency and accountability that so many are asking for?
One thing that messes this up, it's the fact that people are saying they are loyalty. I mean, you need to be loyal to an organization, not to a certain individual. That's where workers are making that mistake. This is their organization, not just a selected few or leaders who you need to be loyal to them. So you wonder again, are they loyal, those workers, because they're being bribed? Because, I mean, it is being known in these conferences that there will be those credit cards that will be going, buying booze, those brown envelopes going around for workers to be loyal to their leaders. But one thing that really causes a crisis, and it really worries me as an activist, is the fact that how are we really going to overthrow the capitalists? How are the workers, when we are losing so many, they are losing so many jobs, when the unemployment rate is so high, when workers are being retrenched, when cases are being lost in CCMA by the same organizers or leaders that are supposed to be fighting for workers. I mean, you don't even get shocked when CIC recently EFF took over and they're handling cases of workers and they're championing it because they are doing it on the basis of fighting for workers, fighting for the working class, not on the basis of business unionism that is being created, a culture that is being created by these investment companies.
Yeah, and that's an important point because that very CIC ended up taking over matters of immigration and compliance and so on and so forth. And again, workers' voices being drowned in all of this. All right, we're going to go for a break, after which point Michaela Miller joins us for this week's Labour News.
Thanks for joining us. The Labour Court has ordered the reinstatement of a woman who was dismissed 5 years ago for her dissatisfaction of the policies at her workplace. In 2015, Teresa Minerals, whose core asset is Teresa Mine, adopted a policy and procedure covering issues of health and safety at the mine, and one of the clauses was that appropriate shoes must be worn at all times. Slippers, high heels and open shoes are not allowed. However, the policy did not clearly mention where on the premises of Teresa high heels and open shoes are not allowed. In 2017, Lachani Mofokeng challenged the policy and was found guilty of gross insubordination and incitement and was dismissed on the 16th of October 2017. Mofokeng approached the Labour Court, which ordered to be reinstated. In the judgment passed in June, the court said on the facts of the case, there was no indication of a deliberate and serious challenge to or defiance to the policy by Mofokeng. MTN issued retrenchment letters as it restructures. The mobile network sent a letter to employees informing them of a planned Section 189 restructuring that could see 136 people cut from its finance department. The operator said the restructuring formed part of MTN's finance modernization initiative based on its Ambition 2025 strategy. MTN says affected employees will be considered first for available positions. Solidarity says the dismissal of such a significant amount paints a glaring picture at the South African society. The National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa is on the verge of a dispute which was heard on the 12th of August 2022 with the Metal and Engineering Industries Bargaining Council because of Samanco management has not participated in the negotiating.
The Numsa General Secretary, Comrade Irvin Jim, made it very clear that the behavior of Samanco has provoked workers' anger. We have a duty to reject this principle where the employer thinks he can just impose whatever increases he wants. If it is 6% today, it can be 2% in the following year. The bosses at Samanco are undermining the principle of collective bargaining with this behavior, and they must be stopped.
In New York City, UPS drivers and warehouse staff are taking industrial action for better working conditions as they hit a record-breaking heat wave in the city, making working conditions very uncomfortable. The UPS staff are demanding air conditioning in the warehouses and, at the most basic, fans in the delivery vans and trucks. The calls by employees of UPS comes after a security camera in van recorded a driver collapsing in the van in Scottsdale, Arizona in mid-July. Brooklyn-based driver Matt says what most people don't realize is that the inside of the truck in the cargo area, it can get upwards of 50 degrees Celsius as none of them have air conditioning. Last year alone, they made an estimate of $10 billion in profits, where rather investing in cooling systems for the buildings and trucks, they are actually putting money towards driver-facing cameras. He continued, the cameras arrived without notice to the union, catching drivers completely off guard. UPS also began installing forward-facing cameras on the windshield of trucks. And lastly, the South African Federation of Trade Unions is mobilizing for a national shutdown on the economy on Wednesday, the 24th of August. Zwelithini Vavi speaks more on this.
Cost of living have escalated to unaffordable levels. The food basket has increased by a 46.5% since December 2019. Today, for a household of 4, you need a 4,748 rands and 87 for groceries. Electricity has increased by a 507% between 2007 and 2022. The petrol price have reached over 26 rands per litre. Join us on the 24th of August to say no to this and to shut down the economy and to make sure that nothing moves until the government responds to all of our demands.
COSATU has also called for a national strike action on the same day against the same issues, load shedding, fuel price hikes and escalating food prices, also for Wednesday the 24th of August, and there are efforts underway for SAFTU and COSATU to cooperate to build unity for a shutdown and beyond. The two federations are calling on all workers to support the strike action on Wednesday the 24th of August. Well, that's all from my side. If you have any story you'd like to share with us, you can simply send us an email to labour@wwmp.org.za. Over to Tashrik to continue this week's topic of discussion.
All right, we've established that the unions are in quite a bit of trouble, and this is a broader implication for the working class. And thanks there to Michaela for this week's Labour news. I want to pick up with you, Roger, very quickly on where this leaves the working class, because the reality is that we have now a SAFTU that is also trying to find its place. Zwelithini Vavi, as you say, it's not a personal issue, it's perhaps an ideological or a different route to gain that which they both feel strongly about. But, we sit with high unemployment, the repo rate that continually increases. We sit with high inflation at the moment, very little to no protection for the working class. Yet, I miss the streets of Cape Town being filled, with workers marching and demanding right there and then for some sort of relief. And we don't quite see that at the moment. And so, be it SAFTU or COSATU, the working class is silent while there is, probably one of the most biggest economic challenges facing this country.
You paint a bleak picture, and it's very difficult to contradict that. The SAFTU, which has been something of a beacon of hope over the last couple of years, but has been bedeviled by the internal conflict which has been precipitated, in my view, by Numser, has at least is now in peril of disintegration. To be honest, people talk about a split, but if Numser proceeds as it may do, and it already decided not to attend the working class summit last week on a rather spurious pretext that it was busy in court, when actually most of the people weren't busy in court, are peeling away from SAFTU. There's not a lot left in SAFTU if that happens. On the optimistic side, SAFTU has agreed on the 24th of August to have a stay away and day of action. SAFTU has recognized that there is no solution outside of organizing on the ground and mobilizing on the ground, that the absolutely disastrous economic policy of austerity of the current government is not going to go away by even one or two one-day stayaways. It's going to need a concerted rolling series of mass actions which grows into a movement to stop this government from leading us over the edge of a cliff. Hopefully, in the next couple of weeks, when SAFTU's action takes place, it will begin to trigger that process. Otherwise, we are going to disintegrate around things that happen like Kagiso, like Tembisa, and so on, where we burn ourselves out with small protests which don't achieve very much. We need to come together as a working class movement, and that hopefully is what has been started.
Dr. Dale, is the working class in trouble at the moment? We sit with the left as fractured as it is. There's been lots of drama around New Frame, it's an online publication that had lots of potential, but we are told now that, there's lots of compromises being made and acquisitions and, an affront or an attack, however one views it, to the left in different forms. What is your reading about the left, if not even the left, the center left at least, the sort of socialist movement in South Africa, and whether there is much to speak of?
Well, I think, Tashreeq, we've been in a crisis for a long time as the so-called left. And I think many comrades have pointed that out over a period of time. And I think there's two or three particular reasons why this is the case. The first one is that if one just looks back at the history of South African history of struggle here, the strength of the progressive forces, the broad left forces, was precisely when workers and communities came together. When they formed united fronts, when they formed, whether it's at local level or regional level or nationally, and that has been effectively eviscerated. The last time that there was a real attempt to try to bring unions and workers together was the Anti-Privatization Forum, the SAMWU, and then the United Front more recently, and those were very attacked, and we know all the different reasons why they came to naught in many cases. So without that, you're going to have a very, very weak, your unions are going to be isolated, communities are going to be isolated, not coming together. Secondly, unions have fundamentally failed to pivot to where the changes in the working class. The changes in the working class in South Africa over the last 20 years have been immense. And what have they been? The casualization of labor. Basically, the majority of the working class is no longer permanent, yet the unions are predominantly permanent workers. So it's a shrinking base. And if they don't pivot towards the casualized workers and to where the majority of the working class is, they're going to become increasingly irrelevant and only service those. So if you take those two things, and then, of course, the ideological, the attempts to big man politics, we have to establish these vanguard parties as opposed to building a much more broader and inclusive and tolerant movement. Those three things, I would argue, if we don't begin to actually confront them and begin to start taking them very seriously and do the necessary work, then we will, as a left and progressive forces, we will remain isolated and increasingly irrelevant ourselves.
Princess, your thoughts on that very quickly before I go for a break. How united can this front become?
We've seen it being done recently by SAFTU and the Working Class Summit, where you had Bantu Holomisa, an EFF there, a representative from EFF. So you're seeing that SAFTU is trying. It's really progressive in trying to unite all those formations in one, all working class formations in one. And we relate as activists. We relate more with SAFTU now because with unions or trade unions, they are more industrial proletariats who are organizing around your factory floors or organizing the workers. But with SAFTU, a federation, it's now being progressive in a form that is trying to organize broadly, like Comrade Roger is saying. So at least we are seeing hope and we are seeing direction and light. And with the campaigns they are doing, like your electricity campaigns, your fuel hikes, your food security. So you're seeing that the Federation is really thinking for the whole working class in broad.
Well, I want to talk about a social compact and what that would look like, because there's a fossil in the form of Thabo Mbeki recently that said, well, we need one. And I mean, that's an irony of some sort, and we'll get into that after the break. All right, we are talking about the challenges affecting Numsa, and the reality is Numsa is too important to let it just go. There is a working class struggle that needs to be protected and advanced, especially in an economy that is so challenged to workers and the unemployed at the moment. And that is something quite interestingly, Dr. Dale McKinley, and you recall from the Anti-Privatization Forum and some other organizations perhaps that you've been part of, particularly in the early 2000s, it was the policy of gear that many had warned is going to lead to a lot of the challenges that we sit with today. Yet one of the architects, the proponents of such policies is saying we need a social compact because unemployment is going to be our next catalyst for a Tunisia moment in South Africa. I mean, what he says is correct, but I'm not sure how to take it, how seriously to take it when it comes from him.
Precisely. It's Thabo Mbeki is sort of calling the kettle black in the sense of he was the very first one after succeeding Mandela to basically implement vociferously and very energetically neoliberal policies, anti-working class policies, anti-poor policies, and to actually take a political class and remove it from its mass base. The reason why we had Jacob Zuma and the reason why we had the split in the ANC, you had remember Zwelinzima Vavi and Kasatu supporting Zuma and saying that he was the answer to the left, for the left and for the working class, was partially because of this technocratic, complete sort of divide between the leadership and the rank and file. But this is the elephant in the room. Is that, and this is where also the left and the progressive forces have generally been fairly weak, is to say, if we have a macroeconomic policy that is anti-worker, anti-poor, that is fundamentally constantly exploiting and constantly pushing us into a corner, retrenchments, all these other kinds of things, service delivery, privatization, you name it, the whole thing, then what are the fundamental policy alternatives that we can push? And unfortunately, what has happened is, as opposed to taking these policy alternatives and trying to implement them from the ground up, from local, we've tried to look at big solutions, nationalize everything. And, EFF wants to nationalize every single thing. When you have a state that has been reduced to a shell of a capacity and doesn't have even the capacity to run a national parastatal itself, one energy parastatal. So what we have is you have a situation where the progressive and working class forces must dig deep from the ground up and begin to create the alternatives at local and other levels and move it up. If we continue to look for easy solutions and easy kinds of macroeconomic policies to replace gear, then we're just going to recreate the very cycle, because power and privilege is going to be reproduced within those very same things. And today's left leaders will become tomorrow's right wingers.
And that is a very serious indictment, Princess, because look, I mean, again, to come back to Thabo Mbeki, he isn't quite wrong, when he makes these sort of warnings. But I'm wondering why, for instance, a voice like Numsa, in spite of its challenges, is saying, well, we can't go, as Roger said earlier, to a meeting, to discuss a social compact of some sort because we are busy in the courts. I mean, I don't think Jim is sitting there in the benches of the court. It's the lawyers that are doing so. And whether it's that sort of thinking in Numsa and other affiliated unions that hinders a process to actually really come to a very real social compact that forces the working class and the landscape of the economy to look very differently?
Yeah, I quite lost you a bit there. I don't know. I think my network was bad there.
Yeah, let me summarize in the following to say that Numsa is arguing that it is absent from this reaching of a social compact because it is quite busy and fraught with its own challenges, which I mean there's a very pitiful response that we see in that regard. But without a strong Numsa or a Numsa's voice, for instance, in reaching a social compact, what would that really look like when, as Dr. Dale McKinley warned, increasingly the private sector is seeing a large casualization of the workers? So is Numsa shooting itself in the foot by being distracted here by these divisions?
Honestly speaking, it is shooting itself in the foot. Because what happened at the Working Class Summit, it's something that's similar to what happened on the 1st of May Day. Workers forgot that the 1st of May, which was Workers' Day, even though it was organized by the Federation, and they didn't attend it. They didn't pitch. It's something that was significant to workers, just because of the squabbles happening in between the union and the Federation. So workers are losing the plot. And this will actually kill Numsa. From it being in existence for 35 years and being strong, Numsa is actually a catalyst in the country. I grew up knowing that these are trade unions, that this is a union that is being changed into the country. But with them being divided and with them being, with them leading this bureaucratic, power-hungry, I don't know what else you say, organization, because it's no longer an organization. It's more of a formation that I lead, you follow. So it's more like they are taking those workers to the slaughterhouse without them thinking about the organization anymore.
And so, Roger, where does this leave Numsa and SAFTU? Is the inevitable a split? And if that is the case, surely it's a bad thing.
Splits in the working class are bad things. So I think without in the mass organizations of the working class, they're not advantageous to the working class. They're always problematic. As I said earlier, I'm not even convinced that SAFTU would actually survive the withdrawal of Numsa. I think it would be pushed to, because it is such an important force. It's about half the membership. It's about half, therefore, of the revenue of SAFTU. If Numsa were to withdraw, as it withdrew from the Working Class Summit, then we would be in serious trouble. But we hope, I think, the first hope is that Numsa will be brought to order in terms of how it behaved in relation to its Congress in the court case that takes place on Friday week, where I would hope, and I think others of a progressive ilk would hope, that Numsa, that the court will say that what happened in Cape Town was null and void. Then there will have to be another Congress. And there will have to be another Congress with an election for another leadership. And this leadership was not then elected in Cape Town. Okay, so the person who currently is sitting in the chair of the Deputy General Secretary would have to vacate that seat. And there would have to be a new set of elections. So there is hope. Always there is hope that
on that hope, I rest, I suppose, our conversation that hopefully there will be a consolidation of worker power and people will come to their senses in trying to not just save the union, but save the union for the broader working class. On that note, thank you very much for tuning in to Workers' World's Labour Show. Until we chat again, have a lovely day.